the last 40 years. It's really shocking. So I think given that, you can never quite have a perfect world. And to me, the intensification, provided we do still have those areas of land which we set aside for biodiversity, feels like it's the only way that we're actually going to be able to feed the world. But it is absolutely true that the things we need to do to intensify that land, including pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers, are damaging and cause local damage at a much higher rate than doing organic farming would. So you might want to not to live next door to the farm, but to feed the world. I feel like that may end up being a necessary evil, but where we put that farm, where we put those farms, how the land tenure is organised around that, as in land ownership is organised around that, is a really complicated question. That was organic food. Pigs is a quicker answer. Pigs do not produce methane, or if they do, it's a very small amount in the same kind of region as humans. They are omnivores. They eat meat, they eat vegetables, they eat everything like us.
Thank you. Next we'll go on to Ayman.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I don't have much to add. I think Amy did a brilliant job answering those two questions. I would perhaps for the first of them make even more of a link to biodiversity loss in the current context, as well, we're not quite sure where the coronavirus emerged from and how it transmitted to human beings, but there is a narrative that is the main one currently, that, well, it happened because of loss of habitat in the area of Wuhan in China and wet markets. And I mean, you must be familiar with the narrative a bit more, but deforestation can have and has actually a direct impact in terms of health. Whether or not that is the source and cause of the current pandemic is something still to be further clarified, but it's quite likely that it is to be the case. So as you can see, well, on my shirt, you can see the SDG wheel, because we're discussing about SDG 2, as was very eloquently recalled by Nico and Rehema and others, but they're all interconnected, right? All the SDGs are interconnected. You see connections between, we talked about climate, we talked about diversity. Each of them has their own SDG, but everything is interconnected with each other. Then for the very interesting question by Nia, just want to perhaps clarify one thing. Climate change per se doesn't cause droughts and floods. What it does cause is having more of them and having more intense droughts and floods. Droughts and floods are part of the broader climate space, and then climate change refers to how the climate is changing, and specifically in the case of our conversation, due to human activities. What we humans do. Amy was referring very aptly to some of the interfaces with food system. She wanted to say more about waste, which is a very important topic. There's a very important link to be made there. Also about, I mean, she was talking about meat, and I mean, she did an amazing job there. I'm not going to go over that again, but you can see the kind of interface there is right there. So in terms of what you can do, typically following the three pillars, specifically on food systems, there's nothing I can add to what Amy was saying earlier, but in terms of your carbon footprint, in terms of mitigation, the first step, if you will, before you get to adaptation. So one of the elements there is what you eat, that's what Amy was referring to, but also how you move around, what kind of transportation you use. Do you take the plane? How often do you take it? Do you take the car? Do you take that kind of individual mode of transport as opposed to more public transport, like the train, that is quite environmental and climate friendly, as opposed to taking the plane to go from, let's say, Cambridge to London, although that'd be a very short distance. So I'm not sure, definitely I would have strong doubts as whether or not taking a flight would be justifiable, but taking a train to do that as opposed to taking the car is far better for the environment. So transport is a big part of it. But the reality of it is, and unfortunately, we are seeing it when it comes to the impact of the current pandemic of coronavirus. So all of us, most of us, well, a large amount of us are staying at home. I haven't really been out of home more than once a week for the last month and a half, just to buy food, as opposed to my usual way of life. And I think a lot of us are doing the same all over the world. But in spite of that, the reduction, and we are seeing a reduction in greenhouse gas emission, but it's only about, well, there's a lot of controversy reusing the term that Alex was saying, that you have different ways of looking at numbers or things and trade-offs often, but some of the numbers are around 7 or 8% in terms of reduction of greenhouse gas emission as linked to the current stay-at-home that a lot of the world has. We could have assumed that number to be more because people are not traveling anymore. Most of the airlines are not flying. People are not taking their cars. A lot of them are not taking their cars to go to their jobs and instead using tools like the one we're using now to work remotely. So why is that? And that is mostly because the structure of our energies, how we produce energy, how we use energy, apart from transport, hasn't really evolved. We ironically using more energy in our home, and it makes sense because we're spending more time there. We're using more electricity. We're using more electricity to heat. We're using more electricity to make the room go cooler as well. We're using more electricity for the internet as well. We're not as efficient when it comes to all being in the same place to work using the same tools as well. So we, instead of just talking to each other, we always have to use tools like Zoom, for example, that require energy, and that energy doesn't just come from thin air. It is produced by an energy infrastructure that in most countries of the world still relies heavily on fossil fuel. So the concentration, and all this to say that although we are reducing our emissions, the concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is still increasing, because it's a bit like a bank, if you will. If you have a bank account, and the bank account, unfortunately, well, typically if you have a bank account, you like for it to go bigger, right? If you're saving money, you're happy if you see the money increase. In the case of the greenhouse gas, is the opposite. It's a bank account that you have, and you want it to go as small as possible over time. And every year, you're adding money to the bank account, unfortunately. And that money is actually the greenhouse gas emissions that the world is producing every year. So all this very awkwardly phrased comparison to drive the point that when it comes to those emissions, although we're adding less than before, we are still adding instead of reducing, right? So because of that, the trend, although it has slowed down, is nowhere near what it needs to be to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Even the least ambitious objective of the Paris Agreement, the 2-degree objective, let alone the 1.5 degree. So I hope that, I went into more detail than I would have liked, Mia, but I hope that is helpful and it addresses your question. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, it does. Nico and I were just talking, and we wanted to also give Rehema a chance to have a last word. I know we're coming very close to the end of this seminar, but you can still put up your hand for if you have another question, because we could try to just go 15 minutes over so that if there's other questions, people can answer them. What we just wanted to do is first to come back to Rehema, and we wanted to just ask you, because we've talked a little bit, we had a question about organic agriculture and about how agriculture and the weather and the climate are all connected. And we were just wondering, from what you see in Kenya and what you've seen during this current emergency that you talked about in your speech, what do you think it's going to be like while you're growing up for agriculture and for food? Do you think it's going to get better, or maybe worse and then better as people realize? What do you think?
So I think it's going to get worse than better, because after this pandemic ends, and I'm not sure that's happening anytime soon, it's the government will take a lot of time to recover. So it will get worse than better.
Yeah.
But it will take a lot of time to get better.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I think we're just gonna go on to the very last couple of questions. So, Harry, do you have a question?
Okay.
Yes, so a lot of people refer to the term like it's bad for the environment and good for the environment, but is it the case that it's, when we say it's good for the environment, is it actually like not harming the environment, or like actually being good and helping? Because I was under the impression that like when you say it, it's kind of a thing like I don't really know how to explain it, but it kind of means like it's not harming the environment. But a lot of people are like, oh, it's good for the environment, when it's actually just not doing anything bad for it, which, if that's the case, I don't think we're doing amazingly.